I bought a plot of land to build a quiet cabin. My daughter-in-law found out and screamed, "Why should you get peace before we do?" She pressured my son to claim I was unfit. I found my tools gone and my blueprint shredded, but they didn't realize the deed had already been transferred to someone who. I watched the blueprints scatter across the dirt like broken promises, each torn piece representing hours of careful planning, and that's when Vanessa screamed those words that would change everything between us. "Why should you get peace before we do?" Her voice was sharp enough to cut through the sound of wind moving through the pines. I'd been so excited to wake up to every morning, and I stood there frozen, watching my son Liam clutch more shredded papers in his hands like he was holding evidence at a trial. "Mom, we need to talk about this," he said, but he wouldn't look at me, wouldn't meet my eyes the way he used to when he was a boy and knew he'd done something wrong. "Talk about what?" I asked, keeping my voice steady even though my hands were shaking. "About how you broke into my property and destroyed my plans." Vanessa stepped forward, her designer boots crunching on the gravel I'd had delivered just 3 days earlier. "These aren't plans, Alina. This is a waste of money. Your money. Our inheritance." The word hung in the air between us like poison, and that's when I really understood what was happening here. I've always been too proud for my own good. My late husband Robert used to tell me that all the time. Said I'd rather build a bridge alone than ask someone to hand me a hammer. And maybe he was right, because here I was at 67 years old, standing on a half-cleared plot of land, with my own family treating me like I'd lost my mind. 40 years as a civil engineer taught me how to solve problems with precision and planning, how to measure twice and cut once, but it never taught me how to handle betrayal from the people who were supposed to love you most. My flaw wasn't cruelty or meanness. It was this stubborn independence that made me think I could handle everything myself, that made me push people away even when I needed them, and now that pride was about to cost me more than I'd realized. "We've talked to a lawyer," Liam said quietly, finally looking up at me, and I saw something in his eyes that made my chest tighten. "What kind of lawyer?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Vanessa smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. The kind that helps families when someone isn't capable of managing their own affairs anymore, when they're showing signs of decline. The word decline felt like a slap across the face, and I took a step backward without meaning to. "I'm building a cabin," I said, and my voice sounded smaller than I wanted it to. "That's not a sign of anything except wanting some peace and quiet." "A cabin you can't afford," Vanessa shot back. "A cabin that makes no sense. You live in a perfectly good house in town. You don't need this." She gestured around at the land, at the trees, at the small clearing where I'd imagined a porch facing east to catch the sunrise. "This is about what you want, not what I need," I said, and there was the pride again, that stubborn refusal to explain myself or justify my choices to anyone. "Your toolbox is in our truck," Liam said, and he had the decency to look ashamed about it. "We're taking it home for safekeeping, along with anything else valuable out here." I looked past them and saw that the temporary shed I'd set up had been broken into, the padlock cut clean through, and my measuring stakes had been pulled from the ground like they were weeds. They'd come here prepared, planned this whole thing out, and I'd been so focused on my cabin dreams that I hadn't seen it coming. "You can't just take my property," I said, but even as the words left my mouth I knew how weak they sounded. "We're protecting you," Vanessa said, and she actually sounded like she believed it. "From yourself, from making decisions that will hurt you and hurt this family." "I'm your mother," I said to Liam, and my voice cracked despite my best efforts. "Doesn't that mean anything?" He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the way he used to do as a teenager when he was caught between what I wanted and what his friends wanted. "It means everything, Mom. That's why we're doing this. We love you." I bent down and picked up one of the blueprint scraps, a corner piece that showed part of the porch railing design, simple and clean, exactly what I'd wanted. "Go ahead," I told them, straightening up and folding that scrap carefully before putting it in my jacket pocket. "Do what you think you need to." Vanessa's eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I can't stop you from filing whatever paperwork you want to file," I said, and I made myself look at my son, really look at him. "I can't stop you from believing I'm not capable anymore, so do what you're going to do." "We will," Vanessa said triumphantly, already turning toward their truck. "Come on, Liam, we need to meet with the lawyer at 3. I watched them load my toolbox into the back of their Range Rover, watched them drive away down the dirt road that led back to the highway, and only when they were completely out of sight did I allow myself to smile. Because 2 days earlier I'd transferred the deed to this land out of my name, and they had no idea what they were really fighting for anymore. My pride had taught me one valuable lesson over the years: never put all your important information in one place, and never assume your opponent knows less than you do. I pulled out my phone and made a call. "Dr. Reyes, it's Alina Hale. They took the bait. We can move forward with phase 2. The next few weeks moved faster than I expected, and I had to fight against my natural instinct to control every detail, to micromanage every step of the process. Dr. Alina Reyes was a patient woman, director of the Willow Creek Foundation, a small nonprofit that specialized in trauma recovery programs for families dealing with crisis, and she'd been the one to suggest this whole arrangement when I'd first approached her about donating the land. "You need to let me handle the legal side," she told me during one of our many coffee meetings. "Your job is to stay calm and let them think they're winning." But staying calm wasn't my strong suit, not when Vanessa filed her petition claiming I was financially vulnerable and showing signs of cognitive decline, not when I had to sit through a preliminary hearing where a court-appointed evaluator asked me questions like I was a child. "Can you tell me what year it is, Ms. Hale?" The evaluator had asked, a young woman with kind eyes and a clipboard. "It's 2024, I'd answered, grinding my teeth. "And I can also tell you the load-bearing capacity of a steel I-beam and the proper mixture ratio for foundation concrete, if that helps establish my mental competency." My pride nearly derailed everything during the mediation session, when Vanessa presented the shredded blueprints as evidence of my supposed instability. "See," she told the mediator, a tired-looking man named Richardson who'd probably seen 1,000 family disputes just like this one. "She's wasting money on impossible projects, building a cabin at her age with her health issues." "I don't have health issues," I'd snapped, leaning forward in my chair. "I had a knee replacement 3 years ago." "That's not dementia." "Mom, please," Liam had said quietly. "We're just worried about you." "You're worried about my bank account," I'd shot back, and Dr. Reyes had put a gentle hand on my arm. "Elena, let's take a break," she'd said, and I'd wanted to argue, wanted to lay out every single reason why this was wrong and unfair and manipulative, but I'd forced myself to nod and walk out of the room instead. In the hallway, Dr. Reyes had looked at me seriously. "You need to control your temper in there. Every outburst makes the case stronger." "I know," I'd said, hatting that she was right. "I just can't stand listening to them act like they care about me when this is all about money." That was my flaw showing itself again, that hot pride that made me want to fight every battle head-on instead of being strategic, and it almost cost me everything. But I managed to keep myself in check during the rest of the mediation, managed to sit quietly while Vanessa painted me as a confused old woman who needed protection from herself. The mediator had suggested a follow-up evaluation, and I'd agreed, knowing that every day they spent building their case was another day the real plan moved forward. Because while they were focused on proving I couldn't manage my own property, construction equipment was arriving at the land site, survey markers were being placed, permits were being filed, and none of it was in my name anymore. I'd transferred the deed to Willow Creek Foundation 6 weeks ago, a clean legal transfer that wouldn't show up in any of the searches Vanessa's lawyer was probably running. I spent my evenings reviewing county filings and legal documents, cross-referencing every claim Vanessa made with the paper trail I'd carefully constructed over the past few months. My house was covered in spreadsheets and highlighted printouts, my dining room table buried under folders organized by date and category, and I barely slept more than 4 hours a night. My neighbor Karen had knocked on my door one evening and looked at me with concern. "Elena, you look exhausted. Are you eating?" She'd asked, and I'd realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd had a real meal. "I'm fine," I'd told her, that automatic response I gave everyone, "just busy with some family stuff." "The cabin?" she'd asked, and I'd nodded vaguely, not wanting to explain the whole mess. "If you need anything," she'd started, but I'd already been closing the door. "I've got it under control, but thank you." Control, that was the key word, wasn't it? I needed to feel in control, even when everything was spinning apart, needed to manage every variable and anticipate every move, and maybe that obsessive need for control was another flaw, another weakness that pushed people away. But it was also what helped me notice when Vanessa made her first major mistake. She'd filed a document claiming the land purchase had been made without proper financial planning, that I'd depleted my savings for this vanity project, and the numbers she cited were completely wrong. I'd actually been quite careful with my finances, had separate accounts for different purposes, had invested wisely after Robert died, and left me with a decent life insurance payout. The land had cost me less than 10% of my total assets, hardly a reckless expenditure, and I had the bank statements to prove it. I'd sent copies to Dr. Reyes with a note, "This is where she overreached," and Dr. Reyes had called me back within an hour. "This is perfect," she'd said, sounding excited. "Her lawyer should have verified these numbers before filing. This makes their whole petition look sloppy." "So what do we do?" I'd asked. "We wait," Dr. Reyes had said. "We let them keep building their case on false information, and then we pull the rug out at the hearing." Waiting was torture for someone like me, someone who'd spent her whole career solving problems the moment they appeared, but I forced myself to be patient. I forced myself to ignore Liam's texts asking me to be reasonable and Vanessa's calls that I let go to voicemail. My pride wanted me to call them back and tell them exactly what I thought of their betrayal, wanted me to lay out point by point why they were wrong, but I bit my tongue and stayed silent. The hardest part was when Liam showed up at my house one evening, standing on my front porch looking tired and guilty. "Mom, can we talk?" he'd asked through the screen door. "Are you here because you want to talk or because Vanessa sent you?" I'd asked back, not opening the door. "I came on my own," he'd said, but I didn't believe him. "Please just let me in." I'd almost done it, almost unlocked that screen door because he was my son and I loved him despite everything, but then I'd seen Vanessa's car parked at the end of my driveway, engine running, and I'd known it was a setup. I don't think that's a good idea right now, I'd told him. Not until this legal mess is resolved. You could resolve it right now, he'd said, and there was frustration in his voice. Just agree to let us help manage things, we're not trying to take anything away from you. Aren't you? I'd asked, and we'd stared at each other through the screen, me on one side and him on the other, separated by more than just mesh wire. You destroyed my property, filed legal action against me, and told a court I'm mentally incompetent. That sure feels like taking something away. We're protecting the family, he'd said, and he'd sounded so much like Vanessa in that moment that it had made my heart hurt. Protecting it from what? From me building a cabin on land I paid for. From you making decisions that affect all of us, he'd said, and that was when I'd closed the wooden door, not just the screen, because I couldn't look at him anymore without saying something I'd regret. Then the construction started, and I watched from a distance as heavy equipment arrived at the site, as workers began clearing more land and preparing for foundation work. I'd driven out there one morning, parked on the access road, and just watched through my windshield as a small excavator dug into the earth. A truck pulled up next to me and the driver rolled down his window. You the owner, he'd called over. Not anymore, I'd answered honestly, and he'd looked confused but had shrugged and driven onto the site. The sign went up a week later, a professional-looking wooden post with carved letters that read Future Site, Willow Creek Recovery Center, and I'd taken a photo of it with my phone and just stared at it for a long time. This was really happening, the plan was working, and soon Vanessa would drive by and see it and realize that everything she'd been fighting for was already gone. I'd underestimated how quickly she'd react. The phone call came at 6 a.m, Vanessa's voice shrill with anger. What the hell did you do? She'd screamed before I was even fully awake. Good morning to you too, I'd said, sitting up in bed and reaching for my glasses. Don't play games with me, Alina. There's a sign on that property. What is Willow Creek Recovery Center? Exactly what it sounds like, I'd said, and I'd let myself smile even though she couldn't see it. A recovery center for families dealing with trauma. You can't build that there, she'd said. That's your land, our land. Actually, it's not, I'd told her. I transferred the deed weeks ago. The foundation owns it now. The silence on the other end of the phone had been beautiful and terrible all at once. You what? She'd finally whispered. I donated it, I'd said calmly, to a worthy cause. The hearing is in 3 days, and I suggest you and your lawyer come prepared to explain why you're trying to control property I no longer own. She'd hung up on me and I'd sat there in my bed feeling victorious and hollow at the same time, because winning this battle meant admitting how broken my family had become, meant accepting that my own son had sided against me. My pride had kept me from reaching out to Liam before all this started, from sitting down with him and explaining why I wanted the cabin, why I needed something that was just mine, and maybe if I'd been less stubborn, we could have avoided this whole mess. But I'd assumed he'd understand, assumed he'd support me the way Robert always had, and that assumption had been my mistake. The hearing arrived faster than I expected, and I dressed carefully that morning, choosing a navy blue suit that Robert had always said made me look professional and put together. Dr. Reyes met me at the courthouse, carrying a leather folder stuffed with documents. Are you ready? She'd asked, and I'd nodded even though my stomach was churning. Ready as I'll ever be. We'd walked into the courtroom together, and I'd seen Vanessa and Liam already seated with their lawyer, a sharp-looking woman in her 50s who'd glanced at us with barely concealed irritation. Judge Harold Brenner had entered, a tired-looking man with grey hair and reading glasses, and everyone had stood. Please be seated, he'd said, settling into his chair and opening the case file. This is the matter of Hale versus Hale, petition for financial guardianship. Let's begin. Vanessa's lawyer had gone first, presenting their case with practiced efficiency. Your Honor, we're here today because Alina Hale has demonstrated a pattern of questionable financial decisions that suggest diminished capacity to manage her own affairs. Most significantly, she recently purchased a plot of undeveloped land with the stated intention of building a cabin, a project that makes no practical or financial sense for a woman of her age and circumstances. I wanted to interrupt, wanted to stand up and argue, but Dr. Reyes had put a steadying hand on my arm and I'd forced myself to stay quiet. The petitioners have concerns about Ms. Hale's ability to maintain her independence safely, the lawyer had continued. They're seeking limited guardianship, specifically regarding financial matters, to ensure her assets are protected. Ms. Hale is represented today, Judge Brenner had asked, looking at Dr. Reyes. I'm here as a character witness and representative of Willow Creek Foundation, Your Honor, Dr. Reyes had explained. Ms. Hale is representing herself in this matter. Very well, the judge had said. Ms. Hale. What do you have to say about these allegations? I'd stood up slowly, my knees protesting the movement, and I'd looked directly at Vanessa when I spoke. Your Honor, I agree with the petitioners. The room had gone completely silent, and Vanessa's face had transformed into something like triumph before confusion had set in. I agree that the land purchase was an unusual decision, I'd continued, which is exactly why I transferred the property before any of this began. Judge Brenner had leaned forward. Transferred it to whom? To Willow Creek Foundation, Your Honor, I'd said, and I'd placed my own folder on the table. The deed transfer was filed 6 weeks ago, well before this petition was initiated. The property in question is no longer mine to mismanage. Vanessa's lawyer had stood up quickly. Your Honor, this is clearly an attempt to hide assets from legitimate creditors. What creditors? I'd asked sharply, my temper flaring. I don't owe anyone money. I made a charitable donation of property that was mine to give away. Your Honor, the lawyer had tried again, but Judge Brenner had held up his hand. Let me see the transfer documents. I'd watched him read through the paperwork, watched his expression shift from skepticism to interest, and I'd allowed myself to breathe a little easier. This appears to be a legitimate charitable donation, he'd finally said, properly filed and executed. Dr. Reyes, can you explain the Foundation's interest in this property? Dr. Reyes had stood, calm and professional. Willow Creek Foundation operates trauma recovery programs for families in crisis, Your Honor. Ms. Hale approached us several months ago about donating land for a new facility. The property includes plans for a small residential building where families can stay while participating in our programs, essentially the cabin Ms. Hale originally intended to build, but repurposed for therapeutic use. And Ms. Hale's role in this, the judge had asked. She's volunteered to serve as a part-time facilities manager and counselor, Dr. Reyes had explained. Her engineering background makes her uniquely qualified to help maintain the property. Vanessa had finally found her voice. This is ridiculous. She gave away valuable property that should have stayed in the family. It was her property to give away, Judge Brenner had said firmly, and this court has no jurisdiction over charitable donations made by competent adults. Ms. Hale, were you under any duress when you made this transfer? No, Your Honor, I'd said. I was completely clear-headed and acting on my own free will. Were you represented by legal counsel? Yes, Your Honor. The Foundation's attorney handled the paperwork. The judge had looked at Vanessa's lawyer. Unless you have evidence of fraud or undue influence, I don't see grounds to proceed with this guardianship petition. The primary asset in question is no longer owned by Ms. Hale, and you've presented no other evidence of financial mismanagement. Your Honor, she clearly made this transfer to avoid our legitimate concerns, the lawyer had argued, but she'd sounded desperate now. Or she made it because it's what she wanted to do with her own property, the judge had countered. I'm dismissing this petition. Ms. Hale appears perfectly capable of managing her own affairs. The gavel had come down with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom, and I'd felt my knees go weak with relief. Vanessa had turned to Liam, her face twisted with fury. This is your fault, you should have stopped her sooner, she'd hissed, loud enough for everyone to hear. I tried, Liam had said weakly, and he'd looked at me with something like regret before following Vanessa out of the courtroom. Dr. Reyes had put her hand on my shoulder. You did it, she'd said quietly. It's over. But it hadn't felt over, not really, because I'd won the legal battle but lost something else in the process. Something harder to measure or quantify. The next few months passed in a blur of construction and careful avoidance of my son and daughter-in-law. The cabin took shape exactly as I'd envisioned it, simple and clean with a porch facing east, but now it had a purpose beyond my own peace and quiet. Families started coming to stay, people dealing with grief and trauma and crisis, and I found myself spending more time there than at my own house. I helped with maintenance issues, fixed leaky faucets and sticky doors, made sure the place was clean and welcoming, and slowly I began to understand what Dr. Reyes had meant when she said I'd be helping with more than just facilities management. One evening I'd found a woman sitting on the porch steps crying, and without thinking I'd sat down next to her. Rough day, I'd asked, and she'd nodded without looking up. My daughter died 6 months ago, she'd said. Car accident. And my husband thinks I should be over it by now. There's no timeline for grief, I'd told her, and I'd meant it. Anyone who tells you differently hasn't really lost someone. We'd sat there together as the sun set behind the trees, not saying much, and when she'd finally gone back inside, she'd squeezed my hand and whispered thank you. That was when I'd started to understand that maybe the cabin was supposed to be for more than just me, that maybe my stubborn pride had been pushing me towards something bigger, without me realizing it. But I still felt the loss of my relationship with Liam like a constant ache, still found myself reaching for my phone to call him, before remembering how things stood between us. My pride wouldn't let me make the first move, wouldn't let me be the one to reach out and try to repair what had been broken, and so we existed in this terrible silence where neither of us was willing to bend. Then one afternoon a letter arrived in my mailbox, addressed in Liam's handwriting, and I'd stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside was a single page, his writing messy the way it had been since he was a kid. Mom, it had started. Vanessa moved out 3 weeks ago. We're getting divorced. I didn't realize what I'd become, didn't see how much I'd let her control my decisions and my relationship with you. I'm not asking you to forgive me, I know what we did was wrong, but if the cabin ever needs repairs or help with maintenance, I remember how to build things. Dad taught me, and maybe it's time I actually used those skills for something good. If you'll let me. Love, Liam. I'd read that letter 5 times, standing in my kitchen with tears running down my face, and my pride had warred with my relief because part of me wanted to stay angry, wanted to make him suffer the way he'd made me suffer, but the larger part of me just wanted my son back. I'd folded the letter carefully and put it in my pocket, the same pocket where I'd kept that scrap of blueprint all those months ago, and I'd made a decision. The next day I'd driven to the cabin and found Dr. Ray's in the small office we'd set up. I need to tell you something, I'd said, about the deed transfer. She'd looked up from her computer. What about it? There's a clause I had the lawyer include, I'd admitted, one I haven't told anyone about. If Liam volunteers at the center for a full year, completing at least 20 hours a month of service, the land gets partially transferred back to the Hale family. Specifically, a 1-acre parcel where the cabin stands, designated for family use in perpetuity. Dr. Ray's had looked surprised. Elena, you never mentioned that. I know, I'd said. My pride wouldn't let me tell him before. I wanted him to come back because he wanted to, not because there was something in it for him. But now I'm wondering if I should tell him if that's the carrot he needs to actually show up and start making amends. What do you think? She'd asked, and I'd realized she was always doing that, turning my questions back on me, making me figure out my own answers. I think I'm tired of letting pride make my decisions, I'd said finally. I think I want to give him a chance to prove himself, and if that means telling him about the clause, then that's what I'll do. But Dr. Ray's had shaken her head. I disagree. I think you were right the first time. Let him come because he wants to make things right, not because there's a reward waiting. If he's genuine about changing, he'll show up regardless, and if he's not, then you'll know that too. So I'd written back to Liam, a short note that had said the cabin always needs help. Come by on Saturday morning if you're serious. And he'd come, showing up at 8 in the morning with his old toolbox from college, the one Robert had given him when he'd moved into his first apartment, and we'd worked together replacing rotted porch boards without talking much, just existing in the same space the way we used to when he was young, and would help me with projects around the house. After a few hours he'd straightened up and looked at me. I'm sorry, Mom, for everything. I know, I'd said, and I'd meant it, but sorry isn't enough. You need to show me you've changed, not just tell me. I will, he'd promised, however long it takes. And I'd nodded and handed him another board to nail down, because words were easy but actions took time and effort and consistency. That was 6 months ago, and Liam has been coming every Saturday since, sometimes bringing other volunteers, sometimes working alone, but always showing up. He's helped winterize the cabin, built new shelves in the supply closet, fixed the heating system when it started making weird noises, and slowly we've rebuilt something between us that feels stronger than what we had before because it's based on actions instead of assumptions. Last week he brought a family with 2 young kids to stay at the cabin, a couple who'd lost their home in a fire, and he'd helped them get settled, showed them around, made them feel welcome in a way that reminded me of Robert, of the kind of man I'd hoped Liam would become. After they'd gone inside, he'd walked back to his truck and I'd followed him. That was good, what you did there, I'd told him, making them feel safe. I learned from the best, he'd said, and he'd smiled at me in a way that made my chest ache with hope. I still haven't told him about the deed clause, about the 1-acre parcel that will be his if he keeps this up for another 6 months, because Dr. Ray's was right that he needs to do this for the right reasons. But I've been thinking about it more and more, about what it would mean to have part of this land back in the family, to know that long after I'm gone there will be a Hale presence here helping people who need it. My pride had almost destroyed everything, had almost cost me my relationship with my son and my chance to create something meaningful out of my loss and grief, but somehow we'd found our way through to the other side. The cabin stands quiet and peaceful in the morning light, exactly as I'd imagined it, and families come and go finding healing in this space we've created, and I've learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't about destroying the people who hurt you, it's about building something so good and valuable that they realize what they almost cost you, what they almost prevented from existing in the world. Vanessa hasn't contacted me since the hearing, and I've heard through mutual acquaintances that she's moved to another state, started over somewhere else, and I hope she's found some peace even if she'll never admit she was wrong. Some people are too proud to apologize, too proud to see past their own wants and needs, and I understand that better than most because I've struggled with the same flaws my entire life. The difference is I'm trying to do better, trying to let people in instead of pushing them away, trying to ask for help when I need it instead of insisting I can handle everything alone. It's hard work, changing who you are at 67, but watching Liam hammer nails into new porch steps makes me think maybe it's worth the effort. Maybe some lessons are worth learning no matter how long they take. And on Saturday mornings, when he shows up with coffee and his toolbox, when we work side by side fixing whatever needs fixing, I think about that blueprint scrap I kept in my pocket for months, the one that showed just a corner of the porch railing, and I realized that sometimes you don't need the whole plan laid out in front of you to build something beautiful. Sometimes you just need to start with one piece and trust that the rest will fall into place if you're patient enough and humble enough to let it.